We are trekking our way through the early years of Martin Luther's life from 1483 to 1505, and we've made our way to Eisenach. Now, when we last left Luther, his family had just moved from Mansfeld after his birth in Eisleben. And from Mansfeld, Luther went to Magdeburg for his schooling. Then he went on to Eisenach to continue his education. That is where we are today. I'm standing outside the house Luther lived in during those days. Luther lived here between 1498 and 1501. It's one of the oldest half-timbered houses in the city. But before we leave Eisenach for Erfurt, where Luther went to the university, let me tell you a little bit more about this historic little village. Eisenach is not only famous for housing the father of the Reformation, but it's also known for being the birthplace of Johann Sebastian Bach. In fact, Luther and Bach went to the same school, St. George's Parish School. Later in his life, Luther would return to Eisenach, and he would preach in St. George's Church, but he wouldn't spend much time in the town. Instead, he would become the most famous resident of Wartburg Castle, an 11th century castle overlooking this city. We'll learn more about Luther and the reason he was at Wartburg later in our study, but for now, I want to focus on Eisenach and a fairly unknown figure of the Reformation who made his home here. Stephen Nichols, in his weekly podcast, 5 Minutes in Church History, mentions what he calls the Wittenberg Five. 5 men who were instrumental in assisting Luther through the Reformation's struggles. Many times when we think of Martin Luther, we think of him standing alone, the lone hero at Wittenberg, battling out the Reformation by himself. But he actually had associates. He had friends who assisted him in bringing the Reformation about. And one of those very close friends was a man by the name of Nicholas von Amsdorf. Amsdorf was sent here to Eisenach to be a pastor and later became the first bishop of the Lutheran Church at St. George's Church. In fact, it's just over the hill. Let me take you there now. Early on, it seemed that Wittenberg had enough pastors and preachers and theologians to move the Reformation forward, but there was need here in Eisenach, so von Amsdorf was dispatched and he served here as a pastor and as a minister. He holds a significant distinction, though. He was one of the first bishops appointed in the Lutheran Church. Now, Luther was not in favor of anything that appeared like papal authority, and he was against the hierarchical authority of the church determining what other churches should believe and how the church should function. But he also recognized that the church needed to have pastors that could administrate and could oversee the Reformation work being done in a city. And so von Amsdorf was appointed and served faithfully here in Eisenach, here at St. George's Church. Before we leave this city, let's return to Johann Sebastian Bach. He lived 1685 to 1750, over 100 years after Luther, yet Luther had a profound impact on his life. Bach was known to have several theological books, and actually he had Luther's translation of the Bible in his own personal library. And many of those books contained his personal study notes as he sought to understand the God of the Scriptures. The impact Luther had on Bach might best be seen in how the composer would end his musical scores. As Bach would bring his compositions to a close, he would end with 2 sets of initials, one on one side, one on the other. And on one side, it would be JSB for his name. On the other, it would be the initials SDG. Do you have any idea what that might stand for? It means Sola Deo Gloria, for the glory of God alone. Think about that. All the beautiful works that came from Bach that were created here in Eisenach were done by the influence of Martin Luther and for the glory of God alone.